First off, we're going to acknowledge First Australians and recognize their continuous connection to country, community, and culture. Today on Vanilla Club podcast, we have a very special guest, Jenna Lee, a contemporary artist and graphic designer, a proud Gulamarijin, Larrakia, Wardamam, and Karijari woman with Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, and Anglo-Australian ancestry, who works in a variety of media, who interrogates materiality and ancestral material culture. So this is our first visual artist that we've had a exchange with, and we're delighted to have an open conversation with you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right. So I thought that maybe we could just start and talk about, in 1958, Lady Bird published a book on Captain Cook, and it is featured and is referenced in a couple of your artworks. The History Vessels piece, which was, I think, a very dynamic, and it's such a vivid deconstruction and reconstruction. So maybe we could just start there and talk a little bit about this book. So we're in 1958 and this book is published. What was it about and what was it trying to say?
It was, so the Ladybird, this kind of history series it was very much, I guess, reminiscent of children's history books from, I guess, like primary school. When you're in school, it would have been the kind of book that you would have learned to either read from or learn a bit about history. So it specifically was about the many voyages that Captain Cook undertook during the exploration. Cook was primarily actually looking at navigation. Exploration wasn't necessarily the primary kind of intention for his voyages, and he was specifically tracking planets and navigating. But I became really interested in this book in 2020 because prior to the pandemic kind of reaching full peak, Australia had been planning, or the government at the time, our Prime Minister was Scott Morrison, was planning this kind of anniversary celebration of Cook's arrival, and in that process, Scott Morrison proposed that a replica of the Endeavour would circumnavigate Australia. That was really interesting to me because the Endeavour never circumnavigated Australia. It was kind of this attempt to re-excite Australians about this connection with, I guess, Britain. And at the time, I was asked to be a part of an exhibition called Rite of Passage, which was a counter to this proposal curated by Shannon Brett at the Queensland University of Technology's Art Gallery in Brisbane. And I became really interested by essentially this false story that the government at the time was planning on putting on. But then also something that's become more and more known and talked about is the fact that Cook wasn't the first ship to arrive on this continent, and in fact was by nowhere near the first. So we had the Dutch, the Portuguese, Makkassan, seafaring, and we had trade routes via Indonesia up through to China, all before kind of this arrival of Cook to Botany Bay. And so it became really interesting to me having connections to the area of Australia where a lot of these ships prior to Cook had contact with or were seen. I just wanted to propose a different story. And I thought the best way to do that would be to very literally take the story of Cook and rework it. And so the work ended up being 250 red canoes, and it was because it was the 250-year anniversary. But then I made one tall ship, kind of folded boat, and that was a white boat, but it was actually white with Larrakia ochre. And I did that because I kind of wanted to reclaim the power of that one vessel. Like there was this one ship that mainstream education had kind of focused a lot of our national identity on, but I wanted to kind of take that. And then the 250 red canoes were talking about this not only trade internationally, but this inland trade. Australia as a continent is bigger than Europe. And so if we start to think of Australia as its own continent with multiple countries inside it, we also had all of this internal trade. So I was really trying to celebrate that. But at the time, I was actually living in London. And so I was able to go to Plymouth, which is where the Endeavour set sail from, and record the water. So in this kind of interesting way, the ships that I created in London made the same journey back to Australia. And so it was a really special work, and actually one of the first big kind of installations I ever did, and has kind of it like has set the tone for a lot of my works to follow.
That's so cool. And you mentioned the Makkassan trade, and I read that the word rupiah again has a centuries-long background, whereby I'm not sure exactly which peoples in this continent would use it, but it came from Indonesia. I mean, we know rupiah. If you've been to Bali, you know rupiah. This was material trade. There was a linguistic syncretism and connection that, as you mentioned earlier, was totally overlooked during this major event.
Absolutely, and it's in Yolngu, which is the language. Yolngu Mata, which is spoken kind of up around Yirrkala, so just east of Larrakia. But it's really interesting you bring that up, because I was just yesterday making a work about exactly this, about the trade and contact with Makkassan traders. And it's evident in Darwin on Larrakia country through the presence of tamarind trees. And so tamarind trees are not native to Australia, but very, very old ones appear all across the north of Australia. And these were traded specifically for trepang, or sea cucumbers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm making a work about the tamarind because at one of our most significant sites in Darwin, it's an ancestral burial ground, and there is a giant tamarind tree. And when I was up there a few weeks ago, I visited the tamarind tree and recorded a lot of footage of its leaves, but also just kind of reconnected with that site, which is actually just behind where now the Mindle Beach markets happen. And if you've been to Darwin, they're like the most popular tourist market. So it's still like kind of this central hub to life in the top end. But I'm really excited to be making this work, because I became really interested in the fact that proof of this trade exists in our environment and has existed in our environment, while we in Darwin may not have the material proof in the same way that exists around Yirrkala for Yolngu. We have this presence in the landscape, and I found that really, really interesting, that kind of the land can tell us almost more about our history than we can, which is really beautiful.
And you mentioned the trepang. It brings China into the story too, because if you know anything about TCM or Chinese sort of culinary tradition, it's featured for medicinal purposes. It's a banquet dish, and it's so interesting too how it was a trade network. Right? It wasn't just point to point. There were many nodes along this web of cultural contacts.
Absolutely. And something that's always been interesting as well to me is that when Australia, I guess, established its waters, all of a sudden communities who had had generations long relationships became illegal fishermen. And it was this kind of overnight change from this international trade network. You're absolutely right. It was this, and it spanned, multiple countries and multiple cultures. We established this border and it became illegal fishing. So it was really really interesting how quickly kind of, to me, it's such a shame that those relationships weren't honoured, because I think the north of Australia is so connected to our near neighbours in Southeast Asia and East Asia, that kind of change overnight it must have been really jarring, and really quite shocking to. I know that there are family connections between, northern Aboriginal people and up into Indonesia, that there were people kind of stuck either side, which is quite sad.
Absolutely. And again, I'm 2 years in as being a naturalized Australian citizen. So this is very informative, therapeutic, and necessary, as part of my journey, again, sort of doing my own reconstruction of my own identity. So I think about, you use this term linguistic poverty in your work, right? And then just thinking about the grass trees piece too. Can you tell us a little bit about how linguistic poverty, right? Because you reference a book from 100 years ago that was, I guess, just standard part of the discourse at the time, to describe Indigenous languages as somehow missing words, or somehow devoid of certain meanings that Europeans took for granted. Tell us a little bit about that and how that informed the Grass Trees project.
It's a nice kind of moment. So I brought up COVID earlier, the pandemic. It was during that pandemic that I realized I had a year's body of work plan working with Captain Cook, but its relevance overnight kind of became diminished because the circumnavigating of Australia wasn't going to happen. We were in lockdowns, we were in a pandemic, and so I realized I had to turn my focus away. The pandemic brought me from London back to Australia as well. So I was back in Australia really trying to think of what book next. Like, what I was really interested in working with books still. I'd spent a long time developing techniques. And one day I was on eBay and I found this book. It was an Aboriginal word handbook, and it's this tiny, almost like pamphlet. And in there, it described Australian Aboriginal languages as being linguistically impoverished, or linguistic poverty. And I found that so insulting. I mean, for a number of reasons. The continent had 250 languages with 850 regional dialects. And also the way in which our languages were documented was by far, like, so far away from best practice in terms of recording languages. It was done in these kind of lists. We also know that context wasn't captured. So it was just these listing of words, like, this word means that, this word means that. But there was no kind of, there was no capturing of the poetry of our languages. And so I decided that what I really wanted to do was take books like this and transform them. I really wanted it to be kind of a healing, because a lot of these books, while in one breath saying that we were linguistically impoverished, went on to not reference where a word came from. So there was this kind of like mishandling of the information where, like I said, there were 250 languages. To not say where a word's come from is suggesting that there is one Aboriginal language, and there wasn't. And so that became really, and I've now been working with these dictionaries, for want of a better word, for the past 5 or 6 years. And one of the things I first began doing, I was pulping them and creating objects, and then I worked out how to make string from the paper. And as I was weaving a dilly bag, which is a ancestral material cultural object, just a bag for everyday use, I realized that it would be really cool to start constructing botanical forms, because again, I'm really interested in both the museum archive, but also the natural environment. So grass trees kind of appeared to me as I was weaving something else that I was like, oh, this will work. But I also really love that grass trees require for healthy growth. They require fire. and they need to be set alight. Otherwise, their trunks, they're kind of the tree structure of them, they rot. And so it became really interesting to me because at the very same time, during the pandemic, my family were hosting Larrakia language Zooms. Like we just all of a sudden we're all inside, and my family, a very, very large family, but we live all over the world and all over Australia. And all of a sudden we were all kind of stuck. So we started having these language sessions, and I was intrigued by not only this kind of destructive force of a pandemic, but also the destructive force of being forced to stop speaking language is kind of like a fire. It's this thing that tears through, but what is left is can be material for rebuilding, which is very much what the Australian environment in particularly, actually no, everywhere. The Australian environment really requires fire. A lot of our plants need it to seed. And so we used to traditionally be able to manage the land with fire, and the environment adapted to that. And grass trees are a really beautiful example. And I actually think if you have a grass tree in your garden, there are people who will come over and burn it for you, because it's that important that they get fire. Yeah, so that it became a really quite a an area of focus for me, thinking of destruction and rebirth the same way I think of relearning language, which we've been doing for a little while now, and that's kind of slowly seeped its way into other botanical forms. I'm really interested in eucalyptus at the moment, and kind of, like I said, the tamarind. So slowly kind of creating these environments, and all from the same book. I've been working with the same book after the Cook series. I've been working with a book called Aboriginal Words and Place Names for the past 5 years.
And is that where some of your graphic design work comes in? For example, that lovely series, I will put it up on the screen in the YouTube video. We have a couple examples. There's the Playing for Keeps piece, but there's another piece that was multicolored, sort of bubblegum ice cream colored, almost like a riff on the Penguin classics. I thought that was really cool.
I'm so glad you brought that up. They're the First Nations Classic series, which I've been designing for the past couple of years, and they were absolutely a riff off vintage kind of book series. I work as a graphic designer for University of Queensland Press on a freelance basis, and I design a lot of books for First Nations authors, not exclusively. But what's really become quite satisfying to me in my practice, and how I find that I get this beautiful balance, is that I design books, I create books as my design job, and then I rip apart books and build with books in my art practice. So it's kind of this, because I love books. I've always been obsessed with books. My favorite place in the world is bookstores and libraries. And so when I had this idea to take these books that were not good, these books that were either racist or ignorant or poorly constructed about Aboriginal people, it took me like a good year and a half to bring myself to cut one up, because I just love books as an object so much. But at the same time, I started working for University of Queensland Press, or UQP, on book covers. And it was that moment when I realized I could do both. I could help create really beautiful books written by Aboriginal people about their own stories. And then in my art practice, I could cut them up. So it was it required a lot of thinking about what I wanted to do. And ultimately, I landed on the fact that I'm not destroying books, I'm transforming them. And in my design practice, I have this broader vision of expanding what Aboriginal graphic design looks like. I'll often ask people when I'm talking about this to close their eyes and picture Aboriginal graphic design. And there's usually certain motifs, colors, patterns, styles that come to mind. And then I ask them to open their eyes and look at a screen full of all the book covers I've designed. And very rarely any of those things that you are picturing are present. And that's because for the authors I work with, I'm responding to them as a person, and their stories as an individual. And so the covers that I create really are trying to make sure that their culture is represented in a way that's so authentic to them. And then a good example is when I have to design for um, authors who have particular cultural motifs. I'll often work with an artist from that group. And a good example is a book I did called Tiwi's Story, and that has an artwork from a Tiwi artist on it. And that's really important that I'm never, culturally appropriating from other Aboriginal groups. That it's always kind of done really well. That I'd never try and create a cover that looked like a Tiwi artwork because I'm not Tiwi. So that was really important. So I think cultural protocols come a lot into the design practice that I do. But the First Nations Classics is one of my absolute favorite series that I've done because it also situates these books that have been written by Aboriginal people for I can't remember how old the furthest back one is, but these are now sitting in bookstores as classics. And classics are if you walk into a bookstore and you want to know what is a good book to read, like a critically acclaimed book, a book that is kind of fundamental literature, you go to the classics section. And now we have this whole range of First Nations classics that cover poetry, essay, prose, fiction, nonfiction. We've got all these beautiful genres that have been positioned as essential reading. And a lot of these books I grew up with kind of in the house as a kid. So it's been really special.
So when I look at, again, just as a quick survey, if I'm on your website and I just have a glimpse, without reading anything and just sticking with the visuals, it seems like there's, I don't know, I've heard this word used before, dimensionality, whereby there's just textural, it's a very engaging textural environment that you're creating, because, and again, in our Airbnbs, we've used a lot of mosaics, and not really mosaics. I mean, I push back on people sometimes when they say mosaics, but we've actually worked with an artist who's designed the Peak Aziet Trancadis, where we'll break various, we'll make these shards and then we'll construct a design out of it. And it seems, we did one entirely in white, which it seemed absolutely nuts because they're saying, well, just tile it white and then put white grouting. But no, then we had the finished work. I'll send you a photo of it. And it catches the light in different ways. And it just creates this, people stare at it, they look at it, So when we think of grass trees, we think about, again, the adornment of the abhorrent. We'll put these on the YouTube channel. There's so many dimensions to this. And then even in the history, the vessels, and my sense of it, just as a layperson looking at this, is that a lot of people they're clamoring for more dimensionality. They want more textures. This is how humans have engaged with our environment. Things are rounded. There's something here. It's a little frayed. It's a little frumpled. But everything now in our dematerialized lifestyle, it's just devoid of any texture. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I've reflect on this a lot because when I was at university in 2011, studying graphic design, there was such a big push, speculatively that print was going to be dead. They were slowly stopping teaching print design. Print was going to be dead. I very fortunately had one tutor who very much knew that it was a fundamental skill. So I learned all about print. And then I just stubbornly stuck with print because there's something about touching and holding paper that tickles a part of your brain that you can't get from anything else. And my whole life is print. I exclusively design for print. And then my art practice, I exclusively work with paper. So even in times where you'll see works that aren't made from books, They're either a Japanese washi or a Chinese calligraphy paper, but paper's always there. Even in the photographic works I do, there are paper objects in it. Or if it's light work, I'm projecting onto paper. So there's this feeling, I mean, I've been obsessed with paper forever. But it also kind of comes back to us. So my dad has the Aboriginal and mixed Asian heritage, and my mum is Anglo-Australian, and it came down to wanting to honour both parents in my practice. My mum used to work at a Japanese paper store, and she also, just as we were growing up, taught us lots of paper craft, to keep kids busy. And so paper's been such a big part of my life. But I've had people describe previously my work as the text becomes distorted where it transforms into texture, which I really love that play on words, text and texture, because I'm aiming to work with these books to the point where you kind of can't read them anymore, or you read them in a different way. You read them as a sculpture as opposed to a book, but you're still reading them. And I found that other layers to work would be distracting. That what I'm really aiming to do is present to you a transformation. And that's why I very rarely work with color. And like you were describing, this beautiful white on white work that, uses mosaic, for want of a better word. There's something where when everything else falls away, you're left with just the light and the texture, and then you can kind of see so much more. I find it really hard to use color in my work because, being someone of a mixed cultural background, for example, I use red a lot. Red means a lot of very different things to different people. I play on that, but I find it really hard to use color because I come with my own, I guess, cultural baggage where different cultures see different colors in different ways. And so I've found that working just with paper, and I was actually assembling a little kit yesterday to do a demonstration on paper, where it's just a small folder filled with paper with so many different colors. It's all white, but it is all the tones of white and all the textures of white. And to be able to put it out and say, this is really important that we think about, even in one color, white paper, that there is actually so much variation. And that's one of the reasons why I love working with books as well. We talk about vintage furniture having a patina. Books also have a patina, as we handle them and use them, and depend where you store them. The paper changes color. So I have, 30 copies of one book. Each one of them has a different kind of paper quality. And I really love that. I love that about paper.
You get that. So you have 30 copies of one book?
Well, the book that I've been using, Aboriginal Words and Place Names, I should actually do a count. For the past 5 years, I've probably used close to 40 copies of this book. But I'm about to present a work where I've kept the spine. So I obviously use the paper to weave or pulp or make sculptures, paper cut. But I've kept all the spines, and I've just glued the spines onto this piece of board, and it just lines up. And I can't remember how many made it into that, because since gluing them all down, I've gone on and used another 10 books. So yeah, I find them quite hard to source these days. They're becoming rarer because I've used them. But the other point I should make about the books that I use, and that's something that people don't always realize, is it's not this book from the past. It's actually still in print, and you can buy it in Dymocks or, various bookstores. And I've actually seen it for sale next to the book covers I've designed. So it's this weird moment where it's not an irrelevant book. It's actually still in print, and it still has some pretty harmful misrepresentations of language. It flattens it, it homogenizes it, which it's like saying to somebody, this is a dictionary of Asian language, and then not saying where words come from. It's nonsensical. That doesn't make any sense. So I do have to kind of always remind myself to mention that this book is still in print. While I've used 50 copies, and the edition I use is usually from the 60s or the 80s. You can go and buy a brand new one tomorrow if you wanted. But yeah, it's kind of an obsession of mine now.
So Playing for keeps. You've got 4 aces. You've got one that says archived, one that says abducted, another that says acquired, and then another, the ace of clubs, that seems to say accumulated. Tell us a little bit about this project.
So this is another one. A little while ago, I commissioned some like professionally made paper where I supplied the ripped up paper, and it was a book called The Lost Boomerang. So it was another one of these kind of childhood reading books, and it was a story about this lost boomerang. And I became really, again, language plays into my work in so many different ways. This idea of a lost boomerang. I was doing a lot of research and interrogation of museum archives, and so I decided to come up with a list of 52 different words that could describe Aboriginal objects that were, I guess, for want of a better word, acquired by museums or by collectors, particularly, during kind of, I guess, peak colonization. Objects were just taken very often under fairly violent circumstances. And then the recording of where those objects came from, who made them, was just not recorded. There was very little information. So a lot of the museums that I was working in England, accessing objects, I would say I would like to look at Larrakia objects, and very rarely could a museum actually give me a Larrakia object because the provenancing was so poor that it was realistically likely to say Northern Territory or South Australia, because prior to the Northern Territory being established, it was part of South Australia, which is unhelpful. It's a huge land area. So I became really interested in this kind of, again, it's this lack of information that was taken. But at the same time, the attitude of the time was, well, we need to take it to protect it. Kind of failing to do anything good in that process. So I then created this set of 52 playing cards, like a deck of regular cards, and every card has an illustration of an object currently in the British Museum, kind of the museum of museums known for dodgy practices historically. So I went onto their database and I illustrated kind of all of these objects. I then put them on playing cards with words attached to better describe this idea of lost. Again, made from the book, The Lost Boomerang. And it was at the time where I was still working with some fiction books. So around 2020, 2021, I was working with a book called Biggles in Australia. I was working with this Captain Cook book and The Lost Boomerang, kind of all before I found this dictionary that I've been now exclusively obsessed with. So the Playing for Keeps I created, I actually called it an artist book because that is really interesting to me, to have the individual cards put in a box, then make it like a loose leaf artist book. And again, artist books are really interesting to me. So it was a 52-page loose leaf artist book, but it was a deck of playing cards. And I made a few copies of that, and then have just done a series where you were able to buy, through my gallery, buy just a set. So like the threes or the twos or the aces. And then really interestingly, we displayed them at an art fair and someone stole some. So it was kind of this, yeah, I know, this full circle. Where I'd made this work about the stealing of cultural artifacts and then someone stole some.
Now you're a performance artist.
Exactly. I know, my gallerist was just so apologetic, and I kind of thought, no, this is perfect. So I'm going to pick them up this afternoon and I'm going to create a new work with the cards that remain. I don't know what I'll do with them, but yeah, just a funny full circle. And I've always loved that series because I'm also really interested in paper ephemera. So cards, matchboxes, bookmarks, postcards. I haven't worked too much with them in my practice more broadly, but it's that obsession with paper. Anything with paper, I kind of have been slowly collecting as well in the hopes that the right work will present itself.
So you've done a number of exhibitions and some residencies abroad, overseas. Tell us a little bit about Invasive Native, which was an installation, I think, in Japan, with the flat panel screens depicting natural scenes, depicting flora in this very brutalist type of environment.
Yes, so I've got works currently in Satoshi Triennial. So I've got those works, and then I think Invasive Native was a series that I made when I was living in London. And while I wasn't there technically on a residency, I kind of treated it as one, and I photographed eucalyptus trees growing in Kew Gardens, which is, if you don't know what Kew Gardens is, it's like a botanic garden, but it's actually more a museum and an archive of living plants, which is, again, really interesting. But I've been going to Japan a couple of times a year for the past kind of 4 or 5 years. And again, it comes back to paper. Well, yes, I have Japanese heritage, and I very much love being in Japan and connecting with that part of me. Originally, it was because I wanted to research paper. And the craft, there's heritage craft making in Japan around paper, where it's still made in quite an analog way. And I was really excited to explore that. But the works I have on Satoshi, in Satoshi Triennial on Toshima Island, kind of linked to this exploration of eucalyptus as well. I've got a room there, and I do need to update my website with all of these works, but it is on my Instagram. They're falling leaves, where I've suspended leaves in this in a beautiful but abandoned house, and the house has been abandoned for about, oh gosh, how long did we work out? Like 40 or 50 years. And we've got it in a room where we can open the windows, and so the wind blows through and the leaves rustle. And that each room in this house, I've done 3 installations. One is about fire, one is about water, and one is about air. And the air room, I was trying to think, like, how do I capture air? Like, that's really hard to capture air with paper. And I decided that the rustling of the leaves, the eucalyptus leaves, was what I really wanted. So if you're in that room and the breeze is picking up, luckily Toshima is an incredibly windy island, the paper kind of rustles in the same way that leaves would. So that's been really special. And I'm actually about to go back in about 2 or 3 weeks to see the work again and to speak. But residencies became really important to me. And I think from my experience of living in London and creating Invasive Native, is this being in a place is a really, I'm not the first artist by any means to talk about how important just being somewhere is, but I was making a decision between going and doing further study, so my master's or a PhD, but at the same time, I was about to go on a residency. And as I was on that residency, I realized that that was the type of research that I love doing. So I've done one in Japan. I was really lucky last year to go to Bali, Indonesia, which was so much of this research around that connection between Indonesia and Australia happened there. Later this year, I will be doing one in Canberra. Next year, I'll be in Singapore for 3 months, and then I'm going to the US in 2027 on a residency at an institution called Kluge-Ruhe, which is the largest dedicated collection of Aboriginal art outside of Australia, and that's in Virginia, Charlottesville.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Yeah.
University of Virginia.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, wow.
I think University of Virginia. Yes. And it's a part of their campus. They had a collector come to Australia years ago and do a lot of collecting of Aboriginal art in a way that was really well provenance, took a lot of detail about who created it. He then gifted it to the University of Virginia, and they have a dedicated museum for Aboriginal art. And they run a residency where they bring Aboriginal artists over for, I believe, 2 months. So I'll be heading over there. And I am really interested in kind of global perceptions of Aboriginal people and culture. So I'm really looking forward to that one as well.
Tell us a little bit about that. Tell us about that interest, about global perceptions. Where does that stand? Where does that sit? What are the sort of discussions that people are having around that?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been around incredible artists and curators who've done a lot of work in the kind of this global Indigenous First Nations space. So solidarity in terms of like Canada, the US, New Zealand, other countries. But for me, and I think it's this intrigue because of my mixed heritage. I'll very often have lots of people, they don't need to be international, really, really intrigued by what I've often had described as this quote unquote exotic mix, which is to me really interesting because I obviously don't feel that. All of my family look exactly like me and have the exact same heritage. But I realized that it was from a lack of understanding about our own history here and about how diverse Australia was and has always been. And also the effects of the White Australia policy. So, kind of really intrigued because all of my ancestors from anywhere arrived in Australia prior to 1901. So, I'm quite a long history. None of my relatives or ancestors are recent migrants. And so then I became really interested in what are the global connections? What are the similarities? So for me, and it's more from wanting to feel that belonging. I definitely find that a lot in Asia when I tend to look more like everyone else and being mistaken for local. And I think it's just this interest in people's perceptions I've been really intrigued by, and a lot of my work tries to uncover some of those histories and kind of educate people or share family stories, family history, to kind of demystify in a way, these mixed Aboriginal families that have existed in Australia since colonization. And so, yeah, I'm really interested. For example, when I go to Virginia, the first thing I'm going to do is go to the library and see what they have in the section on if they have any books on Aboriginal Australians, and what do they say? What is this ongoing perception? Is it going to be similar to in Australia where these books are still in print, spreading misinformation, or is it actually going to be better because it has that distance and that ability to look from a different perspective? So the very first thing I'm going to do in my application was actually mostly about looking into the archives and the library to see what information is available. I don't know how many university students are still using physical libraries, but it's really interesting to me, like in that little section on that shelf, what information is available. And so that kind of plays into that. What is that perception of Aboriginal Australians from this, one university? But yeah, really interested in those global connections and similarities and perceptions, I think in a way to help me better understand myself as well.
Definitely. And again, the sort of core premise of the show is average people like myself, lay people, exploring complexity in the world. So when we talk about identity, I mean, as a mixed person myself, I've struggled with this axis, which is identity simple or is identity complex? Because some members of my family have told me, well, no, you are what you are and it's simple, end of story. Then other perspectives are, well, there's more to it. And actually, for example, the American heritage is in the American South that then moved to California, but I don't have a connection with that. So America is also such a vast country. When I say American, what does that even mean, right? My experience is California and then a little bit on the East Coast. Do I know what a Kansan or a Nebraskan think? I mean, do I now have to reconsider what American means to not sort of culturally appropriate American just because California happens to be an American? So how does that jive a little bit with your journey?
It's so interesting because likewise, Australia is this huge continent, although we have a much smaller population, which, you know, plays into the vastness of our country actually means that we're actually in quite isolated pockets, like unless you're on the southeast where the majority of the population live. But I absolutely understand that because I've had this conversation a number of times. Likewise, Australian isn't a race. Like you can be Australian, or can you be Australian? Like what is kind of this national identity that we have because we're on this continent? And in a similar way, like whenever people ask me where I'm from, where I grew up, my family moved around a lot, usually for work for my dad. And so I've lived in a lot of places in Australia. And so it's really hard to say, like, oh, I am from, like, I was born in Canberra. That doesn't mean anything because I only lived there till I was 1 year old. And then, you know, is it Southeast Queensland? Is it Darwin? Is it like there are all of these places that I've lived? And so that's complicated in itself. But you're right. And it's really interesting when you say, is identity simple or is it complex? Because in one breath, I think, of course it's simple. I just am what I am. And that's what I am. But then you have conversations with people who are intrigued by you and you think, wait, is it complex? Is it a complicated thing? And to layer histories of Australia alongside my family tree, we've got the pearl diving industry boom, we have the gold rush industry boom, we have the White Australia policy, which discriminated specifically against Asian people. Then we have kind of like layers of other migration. My mum's family migrating here from Ireland and Scotland, like both sides are Catholic, but neither. Like there are all of these like really complicated things. And then you layer on top of that the fact that Australia is no more than like 200 years old. We're a very young nation, in air quotes. We are an ancient place with an ancient culture and one of the longest continuing cultures on the planet. But at the same time, we're so young. It's this duality. Like we are both so old, but so young at the same time. It's very hard to kind of comprehend. Yeah, I think I'm still working that out. And I think a lot of artists, myself included, use art as a way of just working it, figuring out the world. I've always used art as a way to explore the things I'm interested in, but also I've had conversations with people that have triggered ways of thinking that I go, I have to work through this and then I have to share it. So a lot of the work I do now is really about creating installations that people can be in to try and help share like how I experience the world and how I think. And it was during a conversation recently I had with John Young, who's an incredible artist from a generation above me who's done this series of work called the History Projects. And they're not just his histories, they are just histories. He's also of Asian diaspora and has been living in Australia. His family's originally from Hong Kong. And it was in a conversation with him that it dawned on me that actually being an artist is really generous. It's a really generous act in a way that I hadn't thought because John has spent decades researching, studying, learning about specific historical moments and then dedicates months and years to creating artworks that share that. And you know, he just mentioned off the cuff, oh, I do it because it's my own interest. And I thought, yes, but then you choose to share it. And I think that was the moment when I was like, oh, being an artist, I'm now like, it's like being a chef. Like you're doing this thing realistically because you love it and you have passion for it, but we choose to share it. And it really was that. Again, I don't know if I can be like identity is complex or simple, and maybe that's what I'm going to spend the next 5 years working out, because anytime I'm working with identity, I'm using specifically my family history and family tree, because I don't think it's special, because I think it
Mhm.
actually makes a lot of sense when you understand the history of this continent. So it's through being like, well, look at me, I exist, and here's why. And then I want to share that to hopefully make it better for younger generations so that they can see themselves represented in art, or to not feel othered. It's been a very strange experience growing up, feeling both absolutely that I belong in this place because I'm Aboriginal, but at the same time feeling very other. It's like this duality, and maybe that's what I'm coming to. It's like, it's, Australia is ancient and young, and that I am from here, but other, like it's always these two things. Yeah, maybe it's complicated in its simplicity. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you so much for sharing that. That I think it hits on so many different themes, because and also bringing in the earlier discussion we had about the global perceptions. How people think about this in different parts of the world is also fraught with different perspectives, different historical baggage. I mean, you take the US and Brazil, what it means to be Black in America versus Black in Brazil are literally diametric opposites. In Brazil, you might appear a certain melanin content in your skin, but no, I'm mixed, I'm mestizo, Whereas the US has this punishing legacy of the one drop rule. So you could be very white appearing, but you're Black, and that, and again, people are rewriting that, and it morphs and changes. But again, these historical legacies, which it's like a big theme that you're exploring in your work. You can't escape them.
And I think that's such an interesting point, because I recently, when I was in Japan, was asked, you know, I have all of these heritages or ancestries, and was asked, which one do you connect with the most? And I was like, oh, wow, that's such an interesting question. And I was able to answer that I think Aboriginal, because it's the most resistant that I could be. There was a period in Australian history called the Stolen Generation, where children were removed from their parents and placed into mission schools run by the church, with the goal of becoming domestic labour, which was a very awful, awful thing to have happen. But the ultimate goal was to breed out Aboriginal people. That the more mixed you became, the less Aboriginal you became. And so, because that did not work, I feel like people of my generation are so upfront about our Aboriginality, because they tried to breed it out and it failed. But also, something that I've been able to speak a lot about recently is that I get to experience my heritage as being mixed and, complex, for want of a better word, because my father's generation fought so hard to be Aboriginal. There was kind of a time in Australian history where if you were Aboriginal, that's all you were, and you had to fight to be that. You were still, and I mean, there are still very not great things happening in Australia currently, but his generation were a protest generation, were an activist generation that fought to be Aboriginal. And so now I feel like it's almost my responsibility to explore what being Aboriginal and is, that we can kind of have these conversations about, like, yes, I am Aboriginal, and that will always come first in my bio, but I am also these other things. And similarly, I'm queer. I've been in a relationship with another woman, my partner, for 12 years. That doesn't make its way into my art as much, because the generation before me, again, fought so hard for our rights. And especially during the AIDS epidemic, just they just fought so hard that I now get to experience being queer like it's not the main part of my identity. And I think I always, whenever I get the opportunity, like to talk about honoring particularly those two activist movements, because I now get to reap the benefits of all of that hard work. And I think it would be kind of incorrect to not mention that generation before us. And, maybe my role is looking at my Asian ancestry. And I mean, especially because there was kind of those awful anti-immigration rallies over the weekend, and kind of use my art as a way of saying, like, you belong here as much as anyone else. And look, through my family, actually, a lot of these, Asian cultures have had connections with Aboriginal people for generations. And actually, you have every right to be here, because I think, and the majority of Aboriginal people think this way, we're a multicultural country. And we're really proud of that. And the first people to fight for immigration rights and refugee rights are often Aboriginal people, because we certainly see mistreatment globally, and we think, well, that's not okay because that happened to us. And so I think that's kind of where I get to play now because of all of that hard work. And, looking to the US and to Canada and, like you said, Brazil, identity politics, for want of a better word, is so diverse. And what does that mean here in Australia? Maybe we're working that out.
Yeah. And again, you mentioned the anti-immigration protests. Does that worry you? Is it a blip, or is it something we really need to take seriously?
That's a really good question, because I think a part of me, before it was happening, thought, well, this isn't new. In the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s especially, there was a lot of anti-Asian rhetoric on television through some of our politicians, and it was really disgusting. And so I kind of thought, there was that moment where I was like, oh, this isn't new. It's just Australia on repeat. And then kind of it happened, and I saw it happening, and then I saw that there was a physical attack on the Aboriginal protest camp in Melbourne. And I went, maybe this is more worrying than I thought. Like, I genuinely was like, I think I was very pessimistic and thought, what's new? Like, there's always been this kind of close. I grew up in regional Queensland, so I'm not unfamiliar with kind of this close-mindedness about people of, diverse heritages. It's very prominent where I was living. But maybe it is more concerning than I thought. And I've definitely been seeing a lot of even like far more intelligent and articulate people speaking about it, especially in the Aboriginal activism space. And I think I think what I ended up coming from, especially on Monday when I was kind of on Instagram a lot, was just like the sadness I felt. To think that this group of people might make anybody feel unwelcome here. It was like a sadness. And then like the leader, specifically mentioning Chinaman, which is not a new slang in Australia for Asian people. But it was just like, oh, wow, we're back to that. Like, this is like what my dad grew up copying, and we're back to that somehow. Yeah, it's kind of sad. I think I'm just sad. I don't know if I'm worried as opposed to just being like, oh, like, I feel for the younger generation, especially because they're so on social media. But I remember when all the anti-Asian rhetoric was happening when I was a kid, like just how unwelcome you feel. And so I think I'm more worried about kind of kids are seeing that and thinking that they aren't welcome here, which is not the case at all. It's this kind of small group of people. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm still processing. It's my simple answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a lot to process, and again, just putting the sort of complexity lens on it. It's I don't know. It's one of those things. It's like, because my thought is that because it's so untenable to return to this sort of like monocultural, racist, racially singular nation, because it's so untenable for so many reasons, trade, try go to the shopping center and go try to buy clothes that are made in Australia. They don't exist, right? I mean, yes, but for 99% of Australians, that basket of consumer goods, even compared to the US, more of it is imported. But I guess because it's so untenable, in a sense, does it make it almost more dangerous? That they sort of, like the Confederacy in the US, it's sort of like, well, it's a lost cause. I mean, they called it a lost cause, but because it's a lost cause, it actually imbues it with this sense of sort of like suicidal honor type thing. I don't know.
That's so, and I thank you, because it's the first time I love that word untenable. Like, it was the first time you almost like reset my like thinking about it. What they're asking for, you're right, it's impossible. It cannot happen. However, you're absolutely right. It then carries with it this extremist ideology of something that is impossible, but that they're willing to apparently fight for. So yeah, again, like, I think the theme of this is like it's simple and complex. Like, yeah, I think we should be a little bit worried, but in a way, like, you're right, we've never been, well, for starters, Australia has never been in all of its history an ethno nation. Like, there's been never, like, yes, Aboriginal people, but even then we were very diverse, north to south, east to west. We were not all alike then. Yeah, interesting. It's I've been really loving seeing the reflections of people, I guess, within my own bubble, being able to articulate the conversations around this. But yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that, like, clarity of being like, you're right, it's untenable. Like, what are we doing?
Yeah, right. So let's say somebody's landed today. They're in Melbourne, Naarm. They're in Sydney, Gadigal. They're here. They've become a permanent resident, or they're on a new visa, and they say, you know what? I know nothing about Indigenous Australia. Where do they start? Where does somebody with zero connection take the first couple steps? Because let's be real, it is a little bit intimidating, right? Where would you go? And there's sort of cultural tripwires. And let's say somebody's sensitive to cultural appropriation, and again, it can be, people, I will say there are a lot of people who do have good intentions, but then they trip into something, or they put a, I was on a Buddhist retreat in Bhutan, some years back, and one of the retreat goers just decided he was going to put on some monk's robes, and we were horrified. We were absolutely horrified. He thought he was doing something sort of, I don't know what he was thinking, but I won't say that he had malicious intent, is what I'm saying. So let me just pose that question to you. How do you dip your toes in? How do you get more exposure? How do you expand your horizons?
Such a good question, and quite timely, because I'm in an exhibition right now at the National Art School in Sydney, which is exactly that question, or the curatorial kind of provocation came from a conversation between Claudette Bullen, who's an Aboriginal curator, and James Nguyen, who's an incredible artist from the Vietnamese diaspora. And they had a conversation a number of years ago where James pointed out to Claudette that in the process to become an Australian citizen, or, do that, migrate, there actually isn't a lot of information given about the Aboriginal history of Australia. You might be asked what Don Bradman's batting average was, which is actually on the test, which is hilarious. But you don't really understand the history of stolen land, stolen generations. You don't understand the complexity you're moving to. And so this exhibition at the National Art School is about, one, that it is trying, it's called The Neighbour at the Gate, and it is exploring the connections between Aboriginal artists and artists of the Asian diaspora, first, second, third generation migrant communities, and their experiences from the Asian artist perspective, their experiences engaging on Aboriginal land. And then for the Aboriginal artists, the experience of connecting with Asian people. So I was the one artist with both heritages, and it's a really interesting exhibition. I made a billabong paper installation of a billabong that used my family's migration documentation from China, the Philippines, and Japan. And that I wanted to kind of share how long these relationships have been going. But it is such a good question because it's not an easy one to answer because as diverse as we are is how you would go about it in a way. Like, for example, I know that if you're coming to NAM, Melbourne, the exhibition at the Melbourne Museum, the First Peoples exhibition, is excellent. It is this beautiful experiential, and it was curated by Aboriginal curators. There is contemporary artists, current practicing to show that it is a present day culture that has this long, and it's just beautiful. However, I know that currently in Brisbane, for example, in Meanjin, there isn't a First Peoples display at the museum. So it's kind of really hard to say when you arrive in Australia. It's kind of like, where do you arrive in Australia? Because I would love to say, go to the museum, because technically in this, in 2025, they should all be amazing exhibits. They're not. Not every exhibit is current. Not every exhibit is up to date. Not every exhibit exists. So it's really complicated. And I would love to say, like, go to a bookstore and buy, books. But even then, there are books on those shelves that are the wrong books. So it's really complicated. And I think the Neighbour at the Gate exhibition has been so important because it really points out the fact that there's this, Clodagh talks about it, there's a quarantining of information. That you're not given everything. When you arrive to Australia, you're actually not given everything you need to understand this place. And that's a disservice to people coming here. So, we saw it, and it's always really affected me, but we saw it in the referendum results, the Voice to Parliament referendum that we had, 2 years ago now, that a lot of people just didn't understand what an Aboriginal issue was, for starters. And they didn't really understand what they were voting on because they didn't understand the history of Australia. And that's so fair because of the complicated history. And if English is not your first language at home, where are you even getting that? So I think there's so much work that needs to be done on that. And I feel like so many people are putting in so much effort on creating spaces where that is there for education. But it's almost like the diversity around Australia of Aboriginal people is so much, but also the diversity of where people are coming from. Like, to be able to meet people on terms that is relatable, it's also really difficult. And I'm sure that there are other people who are like, oh, you should just go to this website, or oh, you should just look at this. But again, it's really difficult. I had a lot of friends whose parents, speak English as a second language, who did a lot of work themselves translating information about the referendum for their own families. And, I am almost positive that almost every language on the earth almost would be spoken on this continent. And so like it's just really, yeah, it's really difficult. I'd love to just say like the government should do it as like, here, you're learning, you're coming to migrate, or, you know, extended visa, here's an information pack. Like, how do you even do that? I don't know. Sorry, it's not a very good answer because it's such a good question, which is like, I don't know. But go and see The Neighbor at the Gate at the National Art School. It's on for a little while longer. Some really, really interesting artworks.
So Jenna, how do people find you? IG?
Yes. I was going to say my website, and I keep meaning to update it. My website probably hasn't been updated for quite a while, but Instagram is where I'm kind of the most active in posting photos of exhibitions that I'm in or that are coming up. Yeah, Instagram, website, but yeah, mostly Instagram.
Excellent. And really, this was a great chat. If you ever are in the Cairns area, you'll have to stop by to the vanilla farm. We've got organic vanilla, papaya. We're actually doing some rice. You know, the dream is to be able to do a pho that is totally handmade. That's kind of the dream.
Oh, amazing. I've been to Cairns a few times. I love it there. And when I was living in Brisbane, and the Cairns Indigenous Art Fair is another incredible place if you want to access Aboriginal culture. Go and see it at the Cairns Indigenous Art Fair or any of the First Nations art fairs that happen around Australia, because you can really see the diversity. It just Cairns Indigenous Art Fair, it's just Queensland also. So the diversity of that state is huge.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you again, Jenna. Let's stay in touch.
Thank you so much for having me. Had a great time.